Like many issues in the world today, speciesism is connected to European colonization. It is important to understand how injustices are connected so we can successfully achieve total liberation. We cannot fight against human oppression whilst leaving out non-human animals, and vice versa. The exploitation of cows by the dairy industry has been popular in white societies for centuries, but drinking cow's milk was not something that was popular by the rest of the world until the 19th century. During the 16th century, when Europeans were colonizing different places all over the world, they brought along various species of animals as well as their speciesist ideologies and practices. This is how drinking cow's milk became a common occurrence for people other than just Europeans. Ironically, around 75% of the humans on Earth are lactose intolerant, and those that are more tolerant to it are from areas of the world that have a long history of drinking it, such as Northwestern Europe, South Asia, and the Middle East. Formerly colonized countries like India, China, Brazil, and New Zealand all rank high on the list of top 10 cow's milk producers. Cow milk is not healthy for humans to consume, nor is it good for the cows to be commodified and exploited. The dairy industry's push for humans to drink cow's milk not only hurts cows but humans too, especially people of color who are less tolerant to it. Dairy is a feminist issue because getting cow's milk involves oppressing female cows. It involves both productive and reproductive labor, and is gendered commodification and sexualized violence. Just like humans, cows want to live and be free. They love their babies and grieve when they are stolen from them. Their bodies belong to them and cannot consent to what is being done to them. Violence is unacceptable no matter the species. This means that when analyzing dairy from an intersectional feminist perspective, it must also be beyond just human, an interspecies analysis. During colonization, cows were imported to the Caribbean and North America, as well as other places, from Spanish, French, Dutch, and British colonizers. The production and consumption of cow's milk is directly related to colonial inheritance. Cows were also used as colonial tools by the Europeans. They were used to aid in projects surrounding agro-expansionism and human population planning. When European colonizers settled on indigenous land, they imposed speciesist ideologies onto indigenous peoples, such as drinking cow's milk and viewing non-human animals as property. Colonial discourses enforced racial and gendered hierarchies as well as animality. This means that Europeans view certain sentient beings as superior to others based on the body they were born into. Women and people of color were and still are viewed as animals, so they can be devalued, and white men were and are viewed as human. Colonizers created a distinction between humans and non-human animals, even though biologically all humans are animals. Categorizing certain groups of humans as animals meant they could be exploited, since non-human animals were commodified and diminished. Indigenous peoples were pathologized and deemed needy of civilization. Europeans colonized various countries through laws and the displacement of humans, non-human animals, and nature. Europeans stole people of color to be slaves to assist in the farming of non-human animals and plants that were brought from other countries. Farming was used to encourage Europeans to immigrate and settle on indigenous land. With the immigration of humans and non-human animals, brought diseases which killed many indigenous peoples, and the non-native plants destroyed the existing biodiversity that provided medicines, food, and spirituality. Europeans viewed indigenous lands as undeveloped and in need of modernization. The implementation of cows as well as other animals was viewed as a way to make the land productive. This brought in the idea of land ownership, which meant that those who put labor into the land could claim ownership, and this ownership extending to the ownership of the cows and other non-human animals, as well as human slaves. Indigenous peoples did not commodify non-human animals in nature, but the European colonizers did. In the 1700s, dairy was viewed as a luxury item and indicated high social status for Europeans only since it reminded them of their motherland. Therefore, slaves and indigenous peoples did not consume it. In the early 1800s, colonizers started paying more attention to what slave workers consumed, as it was of economic interest and their concern over the growing abolition movement. In the 1840s, indentured Indian workers arrived in the Caribbean and other areas of the Americas, as did their practices around food. India has a history of consuming cow's milk, and this continued in America. These changes are what led slave workers to start consuming cow's milk. Before the growth in the abolition movement, male slaves were preferred over females, and colonizers replaced them instead of using reproduction as a means of supplying the workforce. But when the abolition movement became a thing, colonizers started becoming interested in maintaining the health of the slaves they still owned. This meant they became interested in the fertility, pregnancy, childbirth, and breastfeeding practices of their female slaves. With the law that passed in 1978 called the Slavery Amelioration Act brought more rights for slaves. If a slave worker got pregnant, the colonizer would have to provide money to raise them, so it was not ideal. But with the abolition, they had to start caring about fertility to keep their population growing and keep their wealth. This led colonizers to reduce the amount of time mothers could breastfeed, for as breastfeeding was thought to have impacted fertility, but also meant that the slaves could work longer if they weren't breastfeeding, since the law said mothers could not work as much. Imperial economic ideologies altered how African slaves and those indigenous to the Americas could raise their children, eroding indigenous childrearing traditions. By the early 20th century, cow's milk was given to human babies to reform maternity for economic gain. Since colonizers devalued and dehumanized indigenous peoples, especially indigenous women, their breast milk was deemed inadequate. To this day, dairy is still drank by most of the world, even though its production and consumption has damaging effects on both human and non-human animals, as well as the earth. Cows produce 150 billion gallons of methane per day. 1,000 gallons of water is required to produce 1 gallon of milk, and 2 to 5 acres of land are used per cow.